Hey guys, Henry here. Today, some of my friends and I are going to be making Alvin Zhou's legendary 150-hour cake. For this recipe, we'll need 3 sticks of unsalted butter, some honey bourbon, 1 tablespoon of espresso powder, 1.5 pounds of coffee beans, 17 eggs, some vanilla paste, some brown sugar, some cold brew which I'll make later, 1 3/4 cups of flour, 1 1/4 cups of cocoa powder, 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt, 1 3/4 teaspoons of baking soda, all this dark chocolate, 10 ounces of whole milk, and 2 quarts of heavy cream. Wow, I cannot believe I managed to fit that all in the shot. On day 1, I had my friend Thomas over to help me get the process started. First thing I did was put all of our butter into a pan and I started browning it. I thought I knew how to make brown butter, but I was humbled when I turned the stove on high and this happened. Then another time I was beating a dude up because he saw me shoot somebody. I was making sure he didn't do anything. Oh, we're gonna turn that down actually. Oh! You good? Don't worry, nobody was seriously harmed during the making of this video. I quickly took it off the stove and turned down the heat. By the way, this recipe is from David Seymour, so huge thank you to him. He somehow conjured up this recipe out of nothing and still managed to get most of the measurements correct. I highly recommend checking out his video after this one. The butter started turning a nice brown-orange color, so I grabbed an ice cube from the fridge and put it in. I'm honestly still not really sure what happened here, but our butter was feeling particularly malicious that day and started aggressively bubbling up. Instead of popping up like Alvin's did, ours decided to boil over the edge and get butter all over the range. It burned slightly and there were small burnt butter chunks in it, but fortunately we were able to strain most of the chunks out and it turned out fine. While we waited for that to cool down, we added 1.5 pounds of coffee beans to a metal bowl and transferred it to a smaller plastic bowl. Our camera fell on the coffee beans, which wasn't ideal, but I think we're just lucky it wasn't the butter. We then poured all 2 quarts of our heavy cream into the bowl with it, which was devastating for my poor wallet to watch. After that was done, we poured half a cup of bourbon into our measuring cup. In David Seymour's video, he said he fat washed 1.5 cups of bourbon, but I got confused by the half cup in his description. In the end, I don't think it affected the cake too much because it only requires half a cup, but my dad was disappointed he didn't get to try any fat washed bourbon. We poured all of our brown butter in with the bourbon, covered it in saran wrap, and brought it up to the freezer. On day 3, which was actually day 4 due to complicated circumstances, I was on a cabin trip, so I got a nice little change of scenery for cooking. I removed my bourbon from the fridge, then removed the gigantic butter disc. I then poured all of my bourbon into a filter. I almost wasn't able to do the cake because I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to use to filter the bourbon, but my dad told me to use a coffee filter, and that worked out fine. So thank you to him. After a few hours, I returned to find my bourbon completely crystal clear, which I was very excited to see. After that, I added all the flavor bits to my butter, which was a bit more difficult than I anticipated. Once the butter had melted and I had fully incorporated the bits, my friend Caden assisted me in toasting 1 tablespoon of espresso powder in it. I realized just before this that the cabin we were at didn't have measuring spoons, so I had to estimate. I wish you could have smelled this. It was a phenomenal mix of the nuttiness of the butter, the sweet notes of the bourbon, and the deep richness of the espresso powder. I couldn't stop smelling it. The next step of making this cake was mixing everything I had made into a batter. To a large plastic bowl, I added 6 eggs, roughly 1.5 tablespoons of vanilla paste, and 3 cups of brown sugar. That's actually supposed to be 1.5 cups of brown sugar, but I got confused by the 3 chunks of brown sugar in David Seymour's video. I started mixing it up, and I noticed the electric mixer was going incredibly fast, even on the lowest setting. This worried me a tiny bit, but it didn't affect anything yet. I then dumped in all of my espresso powdered bourbon infused brown butter, as well as about 1 3/4 cups of cold brew and half a cup of bourbon. Once that was all mixed up, I poured in 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 1/4 cups of cocoa powder, 1 3/4 teaspoons of baking soda, and 1 1/4 teaspoons of kosher salt. You know how I mentioned that the electric mixer was going extremely fast? Well, you want to know what happens when you combine that with a heap of dry ingredients? Once that was all mixed up, I realized that the batter was much thinner than it was supposed to be, so I added a bit more flour and a bit more cocoa powder, and that did the trick. I then chopped up 6 ounces of the chocolate, which was super tedious to do with the dull knife I had to use. I poured all of the chocolate into the batter, covered it up, and put it in the refrigerator for the next few days. Day 5, or as explained earlier, day 6, was by far the most difficult day. I thought it would be the easiest since I thought I only had to decorate the cake, but boy was I wrong. I got out my cake batter as well as some cake pans that I had bought specifically for this cake. I poured the batter into the pan and spread it, which was much more difficult than I had anticipated. I was worried that I wouldn't have enough batter, but by the end, I had just barely enough to cover both pans entirely. There wasn't enough room in the oven for both pans, so I had to bake them one at a time. This time, when I put the batter in the oven, I actually did follow kitchen safety rules, which I think absolved me of any prior sins. This is going to bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 23 minutes, so while we wait, let's talk about Alvin's cake. Alvin's cake is no joke. It consists of 4 round layers soaked in hot chocolate, covered in mousse and ganache, and coated with chocolate chips. The total ingredient list is incredibly long, but some things it includes are 17 eggs, cold brew, filtered fat washed honey bourbon, coffee-infused cream, and nearly $40 worth of chocolate. I did the math, and the entire ingredient list comes out to be about $150, so rest in peace my bank account. Cake is one of the oldest baked goods. The name comes from the Old Norse word kaka. The Greeks made cake with flour, eggs, milk, nuts, and honey. Medieval Europeans also used similar recipes, making cakes with gingerbread, which could keep for a long time. Romans made cakes called placenta and leave them. They were usually used as a gift to the gods. In medieval England, cakes were defined as flour-based sweet foods. First cakes that were similar to the cakes we make today originated in Europe in the 17th century. Around then, things like reliable ovens and refined sugar started to appear. Cake molds and cake pans were invented. People made icings from boiled sugar and eggs. The cake we know now wasn't created until the 19th century. Before then, cake leaveners were typically yeast or whipped eggs. Now we tend to favor flour and baking powder. Anyway, let's get back to baking. After 23 minutes, I pulled it out of the oven, and it looked phenomenal. It smelled so good. I was very happy to see that a toothpick came out clean, which meant that I could put the other one in the oven. While that was baking, I used a ring mold to cut out 2 circles. I almost didn't have enough room to get both circles out, but in the end, everything turned out fine. I also did that with the other set of batter. I set those aside and brought my coffee-infused cream out from the fridge. I stirred it up and strained it, which turned out to be a very difficult task that took about 20 minutes. Next, I had to make a mousse to cover the cake. I separated 9 egg yolks, which was very tedious. I also chopped up 600 grams of dark chocolate, which took so long. I messed up my thumb placement while cutting, which gave me a pretty bad cut. It was a good reminder of why kitchen safety is important. To a pot, I added my 9 egg yolks, 45 grams of brown sugar, 6 grams of vanilla paste, and 400 grams of my coffee heavy cream. I whisked that up over medium heat, then added my dark chocolate to the mix. It formed a very rich, dark mixture. After that, I whipped up 400 grams of my heavy cream with 90 grams of powdered sugar. I was already almost out of coffee heavy cream by that point, so I had to use some normal cream. I forgot to check how long I was supposed to whip it for, so when I added the chocolate mixture, it was completely deflated, and I don't think I could consider it a mousse. I then made a hot chocolate mixture using 4 ounces of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, and 10 ounces of warm milk, although the camera died before I could get them all in the shot. The milk ended up being too cool to melt the chocolate like it was supposed to, so I had to put it on the stove for a few minutes. Next, I had to decorate the cake. So, I attempted to use the binders that I had as the plastic stuff that Alvin used, but they were way too tall, so I ended up dropping and breaking my first piece of cake. I was able to reassemble it though, so it was okay. I brushed some of my hot chocolate onto it, then spread on some of my mousse. As previously mentioned, the mousse was a lot thinner than it was supposed to be, so it was pretty difficult to spread. My dad helped me out here a bit by removing the binders when I had to add a layer. I was rushing a little bit here because it was the last day of summer and I wanted to get to game night with my friends, so I don't think this turned out as well as it could have. I was also very tired, which I don't think helped. Finally, the cake was assembled and I could wrap it up and put it in the fridge. I skipped another day, so on day 9, the final day of making the cake, I carefully unwrapped the cake and removed the ring mold and...
God, that looks so bad.
Yeah, it didn't look very good. On this day, I had to decorate the rest of the cake. So I brought out my mousse from the fridge and quickly realized it had frozen and was now completely solid. I had to leave it out and warm it up on the stove a bit. Eventually though, the mousse warmed up enough that I could spread it on the cake. This was a lot more difficult than anticipated. I thought the mousse would smooth out when I spread it, but instead it kind of formed semi-solid chunks that I couldn't easily manipulate. Combine that with the fact that the cake layer structures weren't well set, and this became a near impossible task. I was able to kind of do it in some parts though. I kind of gave up on fully covering the cake, so I moved on to the next step, which was making the ganache. I warmed up 12 ounces of heavy cream, then added an equal amount of chopped chocolate to it. With some stirring, it made this beautiful, smooth, shiny mixture that tasted amazing. I took it off the heat, and once it cooled a bit, poured it on the cake. Like most parts of this cake, I thought this would be easy, but I was wrong. The unevenness of the cake caused the ganache to flow randomly, which led to me having to use most of it to cover the cake. Once that was finished, I got out some chocolate chips and started gently covering the cake with them. This wasn't very easy, considering I didn't have the spinning thing that Alvin did. I then brought it up to the fridge for its final few hours of resting. Later that day, I brought it up from the fridge, so finally, I could taste it. Thank you to my parents for helping me get the cinematic shot, by the way. I cut into the cake, and... it was phenomenal. The balance of taste was very good, the cake was light, and the chocolate chips and chocolate chunks added a nice texture. One thing I missed, though, was the sweetness of the bourbon. I get that Alvin wanted the flavors to mellow out, but I think this went a little too far and lost what really made this cake special. I don't know if I would ever make this again. It was a lot of work and a lot of money. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. It means a lot and it helps me do these kinds of projects in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!